My sense in covering the fantastic coverage of the Supreme Court is that it's always worse than what ProPublica is able to publish based on documents and undeniable facts they're able to reveal. So I guess, of course, Alito singles them out and trashes them, but it's really haunting.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you have a justice of the Supreme Court who is essentially blaming the media. Let me point out that the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution envisions both a free press and a press that is essential to a functioning democracy. So it's a little chilling to hear a justice on the Supreme Court sort of lament the role that the media is doing in reporting, as you point out, things that turn out to be entirely true. And I think that it's also important to keep in mind that there are sort of three parts to what the justice said. The first is a lamenting that things that were private were made public. The second is really the underlying question that I hope people keep their eye on the ball on, which is, why are justices accepting these gifts? I mean, there are lawyers all around Washington, D.C. that advise people in the executive branch and in Congress whether they can stand up or sit down when they eat certain food, whether they are allowed to accept a baseball ticket if they sit in one section or another. And yet the justices seem to, operate under an entirely different sensibility of what kind of gifts they can receive. But finally, and the authors of the book on Roe, I think, can speak to this. We are awaiting very, very important decisions from the Supreme Court. And those decisions will affect the future of our democracy, whether Donald Trump will have complete immunity, whether women and other groups will have fundamental rights. And just the temperament that came through on those tapes from Justice Alito are not what you would expect from a justice. I would contrast it with what you heard the Chief Justice, who I oftentimes disagree with, but his temperament on those conversations was very appropriate. And so we shouldn't lose sight of what it means for the litigants before them when you have a justice who speaks this way in private.
Lisa, there is a long history of Republican, and I guess Democratic, but I worked on Republican campaigns, complaints about the media. But it has never included the money that a news organization spent to reveal something that was absolutely true. And that's really sort of the nut graph of Alito's indictment of ProPublica, that they, quote, spent a fortune investigating Clarence Thomas, stories that were so accurate. Not only did they win a Pulitzer, but Clarence Thomas most recently discloses the gifts that ProPublica first told we, the people, about. Alito is one of 9 people who sit in this body, the Supreme Court, one of 9 people in charge of upholding the rule of law and the Constitution in our country, and his open disdain for the, quote, fortune spent by ProPublica investigating Clarence Thomas. Not something that turned out to be untrue, not something that wouldn't have been disclosed if he were a judge on any other bench, on any other body, any other court in the land. But just the gripe, just the indignation that happened is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. Look, investigating public officials is what we as independent journalists do. But I think it's something that's a little bit foreign to the court. Part of what we show in our book, The Fall of Roe, is how the decision in Dobbs, which of course is the case that ended Roe as a precedent, really helped shift public opinion about the court and help the public see the court more as a political body than what the court is supposed to be and what they consider themselves to be, which is this temple of judicial, impartiality. So I think part of what happened after that decision is the court was brought down to the same level as these other bodies in Washington, Congress, the White House, and they started getting the same treatment from the media as politicians get, which they were investigated. They were, their histories were investigated, their personal lives were investigated, their conflicts of interest was investigated. And maybe that's work that should have been done in this more fulsome way before the decision in Dobbs, but it's certainly happening now. And I think it is part of the shift in public opinion about the court since that decision.
Alex, let me show you something that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said in that interview we started with. She's standing next to Jamie Raskin there on All In with my colleague Chris Hayes last night.
But to have any one of our co-equal branches be completely unaccountable to the others is paving the path to authoritarianism, tyranny, the abuse of power in the United States, and it is structurally completely unsustainable. And so it is not a question of if Congress has jurisdiction and power over the Supreme Court. It is what power are we going to exercise in order to rein in a fundamentally unaccountable and rogue court.
Alex, it strikes me that she is one of the first people asking the more accurate question. What do you think of that?
You know, Representative Ocasio-Cortez is absolutely right. It falls to Congress to take this challenge seriously. You know, I think Americans across the political spectrum are seeing this crisis of corruption at our court and recognizing that things are out of kilter. This is not how it's supposed to be. And as Representative Raskin said in the introductory remarks, it cannot be that the court can police itself here, that they can be the jury for their own trial. And we have seen just how badly that has worked throughout this past year of devastating scandals across this branch. From Clarence Thomas, we recently learned, receiving upwards of $5 million from billionaires who have interests directly before him, and now Justice Alito flying these two MAGA war banners outside of his house, one a symbol of the January 6th insurrection, and the other a symbol of the Christian nationalist theocratic project that he was very much installed on the Supreme Court to achieve. And so now we're in this position of significant democratic crisis, very much because of the Supreme Court. Its rulings, ruling for these very billionaires. We can expect more devastating rulings to limit the ability of government to protect our clean air and water. And of course, the attacks on women's freedoms, and particularly the Dobbs decision that, I think that flag so powerfully represents.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Alex, in your meetings with Congress, are you optimistic that they are going to use the tools at their disposal? In their public interviews on this show, at least, they've not projected much confidence that they have the ability to do much of anything.
You're right. I think the Senate in particular, which has traditionally been the branch of Congress, the House with the advice and consent power to confirm judges, does not see much of a path forward here because of Republican obstruction on common sense questions of ethics and reform, questions that used to be matters of consensus, bipartisan agreement, things that people across the political spectrum, again, independents and Republicans alike, feel like must be taken seriously. And now that bipartisan support for these ideas is long gone. And because of the constraints that the Senate is under, particularly the need to confirm lower court judges, they don't see a path forward to actually enforce some of the subpoenas and pursue the oversight that they so desperately need to pursue. But there is a lot that they can do. They can hold hearings. We've seen from, Justice Alito's neighbor, who he implicated in one of these flag-waving scandals, that she has asserted that he is not telling the truth about the timeline of events. That is something that the Senate could very much take up and look at. And over on the House side, I think we are starting to see this energy, a real understanding of Congress's role to take this seriously, all of the powers and tools that the Congress does actually have to protect the American people from this authoritarian court.
Elizabeth, you guys write about this sort of Christian movement, the godliness, but I want to play what Lauren Windsor, the activist, says to elicit the full-throated endorsement of that idea on these undercover tapes for you first.
I think that the solution really is like winning the moral argument. Like, people in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that, to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you.
So, Elizabeth, I'm old enough to remember when just that I agree with you would be a scandal in and of itself. It gets much worse. You and Lisa write this. The core of the idea expressed to Mr. Alito that the country must fight the decline of Christianity in public life goes beyond the questions of bias and influence at the nation's highest court. An array of conservatives, including anti-abortion activists, church leaders, and conservative state legislators, has openly embraced the idea that American democracy needs to be grounded in Christian values and guarded against the rise of secular culture. They are right-wing Catholics and evangelicals who oppose abortion, same-sex marriage, transgender rights, and what they see as the dominance of liberal views in school curriculums. And they become a crucial segment of former President Trump's political coalition, intermingled with the MAGA movement that boosted him to the White House and that hopes to do so once again in November. The only thing I'd add to that perfect articulation of where we are is, and they're going to decide whether or not Donald Trump has, quote, absolute immunity in the criminal cases and charges against him.
Well, this idea of returning America to a place of, quote, godliness, this is not language that I think many Americans might be familiar with or thinking would be a legal principle, right? So it's indicative of the entirely new moment that this country is in, especially since the overturning of Roe. I mean, our book, The Fall of Roe, the subtitle is The Rise of a New America. And it gets at these questions about what is this conservative Christian movement that was so powerful that so many people didn't see that led to the overturning of Roe? Where are they going next, right? And what Alito, by talking about godliness, was playing into was the language of this entirely, this right-wing conservative Christian movement that really, as we show in our book, thinks about the questions of democracy in an overarching question, not question, but an overarching story of being within the kingdom of God. For many of these Christians, democracy, the story of America, is just a small story in the broader story of the kingdom of Jesus. And putting that language in the court, we guess we can talk about financial gifts and like what that means, that kind of influence. But this question of religious influence in the court, especially conservative Christian influence, this is the frontier of all these kinds of cases that we're seeing and what's really at stake that I think Americans need to understand. So understanding the history of how Roe fell through our book, that's a way to understand what is this rise of this new America and what is the role of conservative right-wing Christianity.
Mark Elias, if we'd understand